Muted. Okay. Right, we're going to start again. Entirely seamlessly. Good evening, everybody in the hall and online. So I'm going to introduce Rob. Rob is a Leverhulme Research Fellow here at the Shakespeare Institute and a senior member of St Anne's College in Oxford, where he runs schemes including the university's Michael Dillon LGBTQ+ lectures. Rob has published widely in a range of journals and edited collections, predominantly on verse and metre, Shakespearean and other. Rob's received funding from the Leverhulme Trust, the Wilson Foundation, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And he's been awarded research fellowships in Berlin, Austin, Texas, New York, Hawarden, and Stratford-upon-Avon. His postgraduate research won Oxford's Charles Oldham Shakespeare Prize for Best Master's or Doctoral Work on a Shakespearean subject. And he recently received an honourable mention, which is a runner-up award, in the London Renaissance Seminar's inaugural Contribution Awards for outstanding contributions in the field of the Renaissance. He's recently been appointed to the Arden Shakespeare Advisory Board for the Arden 4th series, working with general editors to shape the future direction of the series. Today, we are here to celebrate the publication of his first book, Shakespeare's Blank Verse. I could say, crucially, Shakespeare's Blank Verse, an alternative history. So Rob's going to speak for a bit, and then I'm going to ask him a few questions, and then open it to the floor and the Zoom room. So if you're joining us online, please do feel free either to save your question up and raise a Zoom hand at the end, or to type questions into the chat, and Erin is keeping an eye on questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you for agreeing to grill me this evening. And thank you for writing your very first book, Shakespearean Verse Speaking, which had a big influence on what I've written here. Thank you to Mark and to Rebecca for helping to set everything up today, and to Erin for late notice, I'm afraid, my fault, staffing the Zoom room. I'll save the other institute thank yous for the wine, because it always seems more sincere when people have a glass of wine in hand. But it was good to see some familiar names when I was looking through who'd signed up for the Eventbrite on Zoom. So I'll just say a quick hello to Andrea Smith, to Liesl Dawson, to Natalia Pickley, to Randall Martin, Joe Stevenson, Mike Schoenfeld, who was one of the then anonymous reviewers for the book alongside Neil Rhodes, and the Institute's Chris Lautaris. And if any of you aren't here, it then becomes this sort of embarrassing moment when it turns out you didn't show up at all. And to students from the Institute, including Carmony, Emily, Ros, Liz, Julianne, and Ben, it was really good to see you on the Zoom list too. I've now, I think, had more book launches than Cher has had farewell tours. This might be the last one. I may threaten one more. So apologies to, there's 2 or 3 of you here, including Michael, who's been to more than one book launch and will therefore have to hear this salesman's patter all over again. In 1935, Laurence Olivier disingenuously asked his fellow actor, John Laurie, "What is this thing called blank verse?" When Laurie told him, a bit amusedly, that it was unrhymed iambic pentameter, Olivier replied, "Is that all?" It's a resonant question, even when asked disingenuously. And John Laurie's answer is a perfectly good one. And it was in keeping with my book's commitment to what Oliver Morgan has called terminological minimalism, restricting jargon, in other words, in the interests of a non-expert reader or a student reader. And that sort of reader, given my book's very attractive price tag, a mere £25, is just about conceivable. Yet Shakespeare's Blank Verse, an alternative history, chafes against any account of blank verse in which the verse lines all cohere into Platonic pentameters, with a perfect 10 syllables and a perfect 5 iambs, a bit like the theme to the Pink Panther, dee-dum, 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 although with little of that tune's zest. For this dee-dum, dee-dumming down of verse requires the severe constriction of ambiguity and variety, and often culminates in an interpretive quandary, a feeling of being unable to read verse lines as they appear on the page or sound in the ear. When students encounter a line like King Lear's never, 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 which sounds the opposite of iambic, it's trochaic, or its quarto-text version, never, 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 which is set as prose, and if set as verse would sound 4 syllables short of pentameter, they often think their ears have stopped working. There are bad alternatives to this tradition of thinking or not thinking about meter. There are plenty of physiological cliches of rhythm, for example, offering us all sorts of bogus pseudo-organic claims. Thus, for example, the old line that an English iambic pentameter is perfectly designed to be spoken with no more and no less than 1 breath. Well, given that the Alexandrine, 12, not a 10-syllable line, is the French equivalent of the iambic pentameter, yet similarly lauded in France as being the most naturally and suitably breathable form, in order to sustain that cliché, as Paul Menzer has noted, we'd have to develop a poetics of respiration that has the French breathing less often than the English. The prosodic nationalism that gathers around such an argument, the argument that blank verse is very well suited to the English language because we all speak in iambic, may by now have become so conventional as to seem correct. It's another of those cliches of rhythm. But it isn't straightforwardly the case. The late and much missed Russ MacDonald told a story of being buttonholed by someone spouting just this cliche about iambic English, who went on to claim that there was no phrase or sentence in the English language that settled naturally into spondees. Russ's response was a hearty, "Fuck you." And there's a good alternative to all of this, which my book tries at least to pursue. Metrical reading can evade or resist the monologic. It can avoid calcifying into certainty. In more Shakespearean terms, we might say that in metrical reading, there can be much virtue in if. We can read Shakespeare's verse lines with a sense of their ambiguity, their variety, their imponderability sometimes, and without an immediate recourse to regularization, especially when regularization tries to maintain a level of metrical consistency or a notion of metrical acceptability that doesn't unproblematically exist in the quarto and folio texts, and which, despite some editorial conjecture, may never have existed. As Emma Smith has put it, Hemming and Condell's injunction in the 1623 folio to read him, Shakespeare, rather than edit, correct, standardize, interpolate, rationalize, or amend him, still needs more recruits. And the Shakespearean examples I've been giving are instructive. But William Shakespeare is the writer now most associated with blank verse, as a quick Google search will confirm. And it was almost ever thus. Less than 100 years after his death, it had become perfectly respectable to credit Shakespeare with the invention of blank verse, rather as today, in various book titles and arguments, he's afforded the invention of the human, history, of poetic subjectivity, of epic theatre, probably of Marmite if you look hard enough. Today, Shakespeare is not usually regarded as the first to write blank verse in English, though that misapprehension does still persist. But he's often thought to be, or have been, the best at it. Wikipedia's current entry on blank verse accordingly informs its readers that the major achievements in English blank verse were made by William Shakespeare. And at the other end of the scholarly scale, Shakespeare is one of only 2 authors to receive their own subsection for the entry on blank verse in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, the others John Milton. Through this line of critical appreciation, it's Shakespeare who, in the language of a recent Broadway musical, puts the I am in iambic pentameter, simultaneously stamping it with his authorial character and coaxing out that meets his own identities. In my book, as well as ranging across most of Shakespeare's plays, even a few of his poems, I listened to what pre-Shakespearean writers accomplished in and with blank verse, from a contentious estate satire, such as George Gascoigne's The Steel Glass, to a risky political tragedy, like Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville's play Gorboduc. It's a book that's sometimes about the politics of prosody then, and sometimes about the theology of prosody too. This alternative history thinks about blank verse both as a technical accomplishment and as a form that exists out there in the world. The book ranges from the early 16th century through to Shakespeare's blank verse contemporaries and successors, and on to Milton, on to Dryden, the 18th century editorial tradition, and finally gives an acoustic glimpse of some modern day editing, including digital editing, of Shakespeare's meter. The book thinks about how blank verse is interpolated by its authors, its speakers, its listeners. What can it mean, for instance, that blank verse is still getting recognised as Marlowe's mighty line in one of Ben Jonson's prefatory poems to the 1623 Shakespeare folio, a full 30 years after Christopher Marlowe's death? Is mightiness the virile style that Jonson liked to sport? Or should the intonational force of Jonson's phrase fall instead on Marlowe's name, Marlowe's mighty line, as though hitching the metre, or a particular version of the metre, to that notorious atheist and sodomite? And what does it mean that later in the folio, we find Hamlet attaching the term blank verse to a specifically female freedom of expression, proclaiming that the lady shall say her mind freely, or the blank verse shall halt for it? And is the second quarto's reading of that line, black verse, not blank verse, simply a misprint? Or, given its appearance elsewhere in the Shakespeare corpus, is it a racialized hint at kinds of blankness that are not also kinds of whiteness? This is a book that resists some standard hegemonic accounts of blank verse, in which it's become an established form and an establishment form. The book's interested in blank verse's interaction with the more popular metrical culture of the period. So there's a chapter which delves into the 14er, this great big 14-syllable line, which often gets described as being loose, as baggy, as overlong. And it thinks about the 7-syllable line, which often gets described as being uneven and broken. And the book has its ears open to European styles of versification, because Shakespeare's poetic geography, as John Gillies has put it, was rarely an indigenous one, whatever that means. So it thinks about versi sciolti, the Italian forerunner to blank verse, versos sueltos, the Spanish forerunner and contemporary of blank verse. And it thinks too about another kind of blank verse, the so-called quantitative versification that was spreading across France and Italy, which proposed that the vernacular languages of Europe should be reformed to sound more like ancient Greek and Latin, at least in their prosody, and that disdain rhyme in a way that we might think akin to blank verse, which is, after all, blank of rhyme. And this is a book concerned with the literary aspect of blank verse. It attends to the double quality of Shakespeare's theatrical and literary art. So there's performance in here, but there's also a sort of maybe a bit old-fashioned literary critical apprehension of Shakespeare's blank verse. Shakespeare, among others, understood that poetic drama does not proceed, as John Wayne put it, on the same assumption as prose drama, except that it happens to be in verse. His blank verse interanimates his drama's other literary dramaturgical contrivances, from the sequencing of narrative, to the fashioning of character, to the placing of actors. I try to apprehend all of this, partly by paying close attention to the rhythms of blank verse, and partly by recognizing the verse's situated qualities, whether maybe its historical or literary situation at any given time, or the way it's situated within individual words, who's speaking it, at what point, under what auspices, to what effect, or how it becomes situated in performance. I also pay attention to the human situations of Shakespeare's blank verse, however unattractive they sometimes are, how envy influenced his blank verse, I think, and how patronage and its attendant cash had prosodic effect. Shakespeare's blank verse in alternative history is dedicated to two great friends and Shakespeareans who are here in the audience, Paul Evanson and Stanley Wells. And I must also thank two institutions that I've come to regard almost as friends over the last 2 years, the Wolfson Foundation, and especially the Leverhulme Trust. In the acknowledgements to the book, I limit myself to including only those who've had a direct shaping influence on the words and ideas within its covers, which is actually many of you in the room, you'll be pleased to know, or maybe despairing to know when you've read the book. And to those who produced the book at Oxford University Press. I didn't want the acknowledgements to become long to the point of absurdity, those sort of acknowledgements that thank the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. But there are many more friends and colleagues and students who've had indirect or atmospheric influences on this book, some of which have been just as important and all of which are truly valued. I hope I'll be able to thank all of you with wine, food, and other blandishments, or maybe I've already thanked some of you with wine, food, and other blandishments at this interminable series of book launches, including at the drinks reception tonight. And I must pay special thanks to the Shakespeare Institute, this most delightful of places which I love very much, even before I say more individual thank yous to its staff and students over wine later this evening. Finally, I may mention the book's appealing price tag, just £25 hardback. In addition, Blackwell's are doing a special deal where they brutally undercut OUP by £1.82 plus free UK delivery. But OUP have returned fire with a discount code, which is available on all of your seats. I'm not missing an opportunity to sell tonight, you'll have noticed, which will bring the price down yet further to a mere £17.50. And for those of you on the Zoom call, I'll read out the discount code if you buy through OUP. It's AAFLY G6. AAFLY G6. All it remains for me to do then, ungracious and commercialist at the last, is to echo Hemming and Condell's famous words in the first folio, whatever you do, buy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rob. I'm just going to ask a few questions and then I'll open it up to other people. But I suppose you quite provocatively called your book Shakespeare's Blank Verse an alternative history. So alternative to what, or even to whose narratives that have gone before?
Yeah. I think the subtitle might set up expectations that this is going to be a sort of 60s piece of counterculture. It's still about blank verse. There's only a certain extent to which I can be radical and alternative in that sense. But the book tries to be alternative in a whole host of ways. So the first chapter, for instance, begins with Robert Greene's 1592 attack on Shakespeare's blank verse for its being bombastic. Now, that's not normally the way we think about Shakespeare's blank verse. We think of Shakespeare's blank verse as being supple, protean, shifting and responsive, not on the whole as being stiff. So it's trying to sort of reframe some of the ways we might think about Shakespeare's blank verse historically. The second chapter then thinks about alternatives to Shakespeare's blank verse. So some of the lines I mentioned, like the 14er, the 7-syllable line, the hexameter, the tetrameter. The third chapter thinks about rhyme, which is after all the most obvious opposite of or alternative to Shakespeare's blank verse. And the fourth chapter then starts to think about some alternative histories that get constructed about Shakespeare's blank verse, alternative from each other, I mean. In the late 17th century and the 18th century, people like John Dryden and Alexander Pope. But the book is also kind of backs up from that and tries to read meter in alternative ways. There's very little scansion in the book, you'll be perhaps pleased to know. Because what I'm trying to do is to make a case for reading meter in ways which, A, are attentive to historical context, to some of the sort of identitarian concerns which have come to the fore in recent years in Shakespeare studies. So it thinks about prosody and race, prosody and gender, prosody and sexuality. But it also wants to think, or I also want to think in the book, about ways in which we might read meter that don't turn it into a whole series of diagrams, that think about how it plays out on stage, and that is attentive to the multiplicity, I suppose, the alternatives that a reader might have in mind, or that an actor might have in mind when they're apprehending Shakespeare's blank verse. So they're not thinking that that verse line can be read in one way only, dee-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, but that it's susceptible to different readings, alternative readings. So there's that sort of broader methodological concern with how we read meter too.
You're not sort of taking anybody on in a kind of battle. Have any of us really annoyed you?
No.
About verse that you would like to. No.
I mean, well, there are historical accounts of Shakespeare's blank verse which traduce any earlier 16th century meter as being mere doggerel. And I don't think that's right, in part because I think Shakespeare's blank verse often draws on that, those meters in quite interesting ways and kind of builds it into the blank verse. I mean, one of the things about calling a verse form blank is it suggests there's a certain absence in it. It doesn't have a kind of character or structure. And there's a way in which blank verse almost relies on other verse forms for its spine, if you like, or its skeleton. So I suppose I am, contesting some of those historical accounts of blank verse, which have a kind of very Whiggish or teleological narrative that sees blank verse as the exalted endpoint of English meter. I suppose I am also contesting a kind of scansional mindset that I think sometimes people click into when they think about meter. But your own work, Abigail, your book on Shakespearean verse speaking, I think, did a lot of that work already, in that it contested some of the, let's say, inadequate things actors and theatre directors sometimes say about Shakespeare's metre.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's true to an extent. I suppose one of the things hearing you talk there, when you're talking about, you know, forcing Shakespeare's lines into regular iambic pentameter, and I completely agree, and I sort of shy away very much from that, what has become known as iambic fundamentalism. But I do subscribe to the idea that you, in the first place at least, try to scan a line as 5 feet, and whether that means elision, or whether it means expanding a word, or whether it means accented ed endings, or whether it means there are anapaests there, or whatever. So I'm wondering, are we in agreement or disagreement?
First disagreement of the evening. Okay, handbags at the ready. Well, I mean, let's start with the area in which we are in agreement, and then we'll get to the more interesting stuff. I think we're in agreement that there's nothing wrong with regularization as a sort of thought experiment. That, you know, it's worth thinking, you know, is this line just printed badly in some way or other? And I also think it is sometimes worth thinking in terms of feet. I mean, a lot of modern day prosodists will say we shouldn't do that because that's a classical way of thinking about verbs, and it doesn't really work with English or French or Spanish or Italian. But given that people in the period clearly often thought in terms of feet, I think we need to bear that in mind when reading metre. I suppose what I'm concerned about is really a kind of over-regularizing tendency. You know, and I think this often comes out of school as well, that I think sometimes school teachers feel so nervous about Shakespeare's metre, and students often feel so nervous about Shakespeare's metre, that they kind of force it into a very regular, insistent pattern, which it doesn't always have. I mean, I'm perhaps sounding more polemical in my 10-minute remarks than I am in the book, because clearly metre is the business of pattern. You know, these are not all just a bunch of completely idiosyncratic random lines. But I think probably there's been a critical and editorial tendency ranging over many centuries, you know, going right back in some ways to the quartos and folios, in which Shakespeare's verse lines have been kind of treated to a sort of Procrustean bed of snipping and stretching. And I am sometimes skeptical about that. I think Shakespeare's metre is often rougher and looser and more jagged than maybe the current consensual view of Shakespeare's metre would suggest.
And what about you know, Alexandrines or hexameters? Because I was absolutely, I think I convinced myself when I was looking at Hamlet that there were actually very few hexameter lines, and that most lines actually seem to scan reasonably well as pentameters. Yeah. When I was looking at King Lear, I suddenly thought, oh no, I think this is completely. It felt to me to be very, very different, and it felt like there were certain lines which would only scan as hexameters. But reading other people talking about it, there seems to be a real lack of consensus. Yeah. Some people say Shakespeare hardly ever uses hexameters, and other people saying he uses them an awful lot. Yeah. So
I think he does use them quite a bit. And you know, there's sometimes there's the editorial tendency to elision that you described. You know, when you just sort of swallow up some syllables and suddenly the line works. Works. But you know, I think it is worth thinking that, you know, some of the earliest blank verses in hexameter in English, you know, something like the Earl of Surrey's Psalm translation, Psalm 55, I think it is blank verse, but it's hexameter. So there is a hexameter blank verse tradition. I suppose it seems important to distinguish between the hexameter and the Alexandrine. And this is where everyone falls asleep. But you know, the Alexandrine as a French form is very, very strict, right? That, you know, actors are extremely respectful, and authors, particularly in the 17th century French theatre, are extremely respectful of the sort of integrity of the line and where you're allowed to have a caesura. Whereas the hexameter, I think, is a much more flexible beast. And of course, you know, there's an English hexameter tradition, even in things like Spenser's Fairy Queen, right, where the last line of the Spenserian stanza is a hexameter. So I think they're around in the metrical culture of Shakespeare's day. And he's quite a kind of prosodic magpie, I think. He picks up strange lines from everywhere. And yeah, I do think that I mean, the 18th century is a wonderful period for Shakespeare editing, and also bears a lot of responsibility, I think, for attempts to kind of crush and condense some of Shakespeare's hexameters into regular iambic pentameters, which, you know, if you think about the acronym RIP, tells you just how deathly some of those lines can be as a result. Wish I'd put that in the book.
Back to your title. So you actually, from everything you've said, have not really focused specifically on Shakespeare. You do delve into predecessors, contemporaries, both in England and in sort of wider in areas of Europe. So why Shakespeare's blank verse and alternative history, and why not just blank verse and alternative history? Where does
Well, there's no way OUP would have priced it at 25 without Shakespeare inside. So partly it was, I'm afraid, a kind of rank commercial decision on my part, money grubbing as always. But I mean, I thought there's a sort of interesting, well, maybe an interesting thought experiment in the book. It was interesting to me when writing it anyway, you be the judge as readers. In thinking about what happens if we move Shakespeare from the periphery to the centre of stories, histories of blank verse, and sort of shuffle him back and forth. So sometimes seeing him as actually being really central to blank verse. I mean, I think he is in many ways the reinventor of blank verse, even if he's not the inventor of blank verse. He introduces a lot of techniques, resources, features to blank verse, or at least popularizes them in a big way. And so he does have a big history in the kind of canonical story of blank verse. But there are lots of times when he's really belated, I think, including in picking up blank verse in the first place. Yes, I suppose Shakespeare is at once the centerpiece of the book, and is sometimes kind of shoved off to the margins. And I hope that will make it an interesting read. But yes, it is really a history of early European blank verse, say from the very early 16th century, where it's popping up in Italy, right through to 18th century readings of blank verse. So I hope that even people who have very little interest in Shakespeare, or that kind of cultivated disdain for Shakespeare that some early modernists have, might still want to pick up this book and just sort of rip off the cover, so they don't have to see the dreaded name beginning with S.
Very good. Does Shakespeare use blank verse in notably different ways from his contemporaries?
Yes and no. I think he's slow to use blank verse. So in that sense, he's, as I was saying, belated. But some of the things he brings into blank verse, I mean, he uses, here I'm going to get briefly technical again. This is a moment just to have a quick nap and restore yourself before the wine. Things like feminine endings, these unstressed extra syllables on the end of the line. Shakespeare uses those a lot more than his contemporaries, and he really ramps them up in his verse over the course of his career. He does things like begin a thought, a sentence, a phrase, a bit of syntax in the middle of the verse line as it's printed on the page. And so there's a sort of contest between the sentence or the phrase and the line. Shakespeare does that a lot more than his contemporaries. And then there's a sort of interesting immediate aftermath to Shakespeare's blank verse, where it doesn't really catch on. It's not like Christopher Marlowe's blank verse, which has this huge immediate impact on the public stage. Shakespeare's isn't really like that. I think it almost takes not quite a generation, but it takes people like Ford and Webster to really, I think, cotton on to what he's done to refashion blank verse, to innovate with blank verse, if not exactly to invent it. But I think, the people he's working with over the course of his career, the Middletons and the Fletchers, do some quite Shakespearean newish things with blank verse, but they also often go back to a kind of pre-Shakespearean mold of writing blank verse. So it does take a while to sort of trickle down. And then you get what David Frost calls the school of Shakespeare, the Websters and the Fords, who I think really have learned something new about blank verse and learned all sorts of other things from his plays.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I guess having performed Shakespeare and having performed Webster, they felt so utterly different that I just thought, oh gosh, can I apply any of the things that people have told me about how to speak Shakespearean verse to this play, because it just felt so very, very different.
So that might be because in some respects they're overdoing what Shakespeare does, I think. They almost take the sort of, I mean, I don't want to sort of make Shakespeare out as a schoolmaster or as a kind of didactic presence, but they often take what they've learned from Shakespeare and kind of plus it and really add to it. And I think that does sometimes create quite a dizzying effect where it feels really different, even though a lot of the kind of basic structures in the verse are quite close to Shakespeare's.
Right. Do different, you said you're exploring race and gender and things, do different types of characters speak different blank verse, do you think?
Yeah, I thought about this because I thought, wouldn't it be neat if, for example, female characters get more feminine endings? It's not true, but there are moments, I think, when Shakespeare is deploying the feminine ending with an ear to its gendered terminology. The term comes from France, and it's in France and in its immediate usage in England is extremely misogynist, to the point where some critics wonder whether we should use the term at all, because it's this notion that feminine equals weak, unstressed, or almost inaudible. So I think Shakespeare does cotton on to that, and often turns that on its head. There's a bit of that in the book, but the book also signposts you to an article I've written about the Taming of the Shrew, where I think Shakespeare is really concerned with masculine and feminine endings to verse and thinking about what they might do to unseat or unsteady the gender conventions they seem to imply.
Great. So before I hand over to audience questions, what would you say are the key findings of the book? What do you want people to take away from it in terms of maybe changing the way that people talk about Shakespeare's verse or the history of blank verse?
Well, I suppose I've rattled through some of those already, right? I want to sort of make some kind of minor, probably pathetic intervention in the way we think about editing Shakespeare, the way we think about how we read meter, and some of the historical accounts that get given of Shakespeare's blank verse. I want to push back against those. But I suppose I also just want to make meter interesting. And that's one of the reasons why there aren't loads of diagrams in the book. Or if there are diagrams, they're pretty straightforward to follow. And I want to show that meter connects up to all the other things that are perhaps more immediately exciting about Shakespeare. So it connects up to performance, it connects up to these questions about race and sexuality and gender and genre. It connects up to questions about character. The characters speak in different metrical styles quite often, even if they don't divide along, gendered lines, say. So I'm trying to show that meter is once a kind of Grundrisse, a groundwork for everything that goes on in Shakespeare, and also a Gesamtkunstwerk, a sort of way of bringing together all the many different things that Shakespeare does into this sort of rhythmic foundation or base. So yes, trying to make out the meter being interesting in and of itself, but also showing how if we do try to trace connections between meter and other ostensibly more exciting and pulse-racing things, we can see its essential importance and perhaps find some new things about that other interesting stuff that we wouldn't have seen if we hadn't been listening more closely to the verse.
Great, thank you. Let's open up to questions that people might have. I think there are probably some questions online, I don't know. Paul.
That's true. Robert, thank you. Thank you, Abigail. So I've been struck as you've been talking about the language of listening you used.
Yeah.
You mentioned listening to his contemporaries. You said at one point the book has its ears open too. A moment ago, you just mentioned Shakespeare's ear.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in how do you listen to blank verse?
Yeah.
What does your ear do?
Yeah.
How do you listen to it?
Well, I think I just try to keep my ears as wide open as possible to think, okay, I'm hearing this line this way, but is it possible this could be heard in a different way? What might happen if the stress goes on that word rather than that word? Does that still work? Could an actor make something of that? Does that change the way we might interpret the line? So I guess that's it, because, in a way, and this seems a very stupid confession to make, I think I don't have a very good ear for meter in some ways, or I certainly don't have a good ear for it when it's laid out in the sort of conventional, scansional ways. I often think, but I don't hear the line that way. And yet I think my hearing of the line is valid. I mean, it might not be quite as good as the scansional version that's been set out in diagrammatic form. But I think an actor could do something with that. And I think it might change the meaning of that line sufficiently to give us something interesting to work with as critics. So I suppose I've just kind of trusted naively in my ear, and this has thrown up, I hope, some interesting results. And that's one of the things I'm hoping the book will encourage other people to do, particularly students, you know, not to feel like everything needs to be de-dum, 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 and kind of thrashed out. And that we don't need to be interested necessarily in what one critic, name forgotten, I'm afraid, calls meter maintenance. You know, so desperately kind of shoring up the line. That you might actually be able to get performative possibilities, interpretive possibilities, out of letting your ear go a bit loose, and you know, and not necessarily looking for a kind of dirge-like metronomic pattern. Sorry, just before Stanley asked the question, but also I think it's really important to look at Shakespeare's meter as well, to think about how it appears on the page, because I think we can get a lot from looking at meter, you know, with our eyes, obviously, rather than our ears.
I want to first point out that when Robert Greene was writing about Shakespeare bombasting out of this blank verse, he couldn't have read any of Shakespeare's blank verse. At the very beginning of Shakespeare's career, and he couldn't have told which of in the plays that he'd heard, he couldn't have known for certain which was Shakespeare's and which wasn't.
Exactly.
But also, I'd like to speak from my experience of editing the complete works. Every play has its own identity and its own approach to verse, it seems to me. There is no linear treatment. There is a development and a change. There is greater freedom with the handling of verse in later plays. But on the other hand, in The Tempest, he reverts much more to regularity of verse. When I was editing Coriolanus particularly, it was a hell of a job to decide often where a line ended. I had to work very hard to try and think out, and I didn't feel I'd arrived at definitive solutions, because some of the so-called blank verse lines there have 11 or 13 syllables in them, for example. So it's not, there's no, well, I might almost say there's no such thing as Shakespeare's blank verse. There is Shakespeare's blank verses. There's different modes of handling blank verse.
Yes, I completely agree. Someone should get a biro and put an S on the end. I think you're right, and that is something I really want to emphasize in the book, because I think one sort of broadly correct, but locally incorrect story we tell about Shakespeare's blank verse is precisely the one you described, of a sort of smooth progression from ordered to free. And you're totally right. It's not like that. It's quite jagged. Yeah. And I think that is because he is tailoring his versification to individual plays, which makes total sense as a playwright. You know, you've got a different setting for this play. It's a different genre. You've got a different stock of characters. In a sense, of course, you would expect the verse to sound different. And this might lead us to ask some quite damning questions in some ways about authorship study, because we've so often wanted to think that authors can be kind of connected to a particular verse style. So we say, you know, Shakespeare has a verse style, Fletcher has a verse style, Middleton has a verse style. I even fell into saying some of that earlier. But that's sort of true and not true, that Shakespeare has verse styles in precisely the way you describe.
It's part of his greatness, the individuality of each play. Every play is a new, the phrase, journey into, venture into the unknown.
Yeah.
For instance, somebody used about them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've tried to do some justice to that, to that in the book by you know, giving readings of individual plays which attest to their idiosyncrasy and their variety and their distinctiveness from all the other plays. There are probably sort of chronological clusters, though, aren't there? That, you know, the sort of, you know, Shakespeare's 1595 style, we might say. But yes, I do think there is a huge amount of variety in Shakespeare's verse, and that's something I really want to evoke in the book.
Tiffany. Thank you. I can't wait to read the book. So my question, given that you were being quite provocatively resistant to de-dum, and I'd say I myself am something of a puritanic or ambitious, in that, you know, I can't stand a performance where the people speak the verse in the same way that they speak prose.
Prose, yes,
I can't stand it. It makes me very, very upset.
Yeah.
So, but I would like to know what you think about it. So Shakespeare writes verse and writes loose verse and writes prose, and he must in some way intend that people can hear the difference. So I wonder, do you think his actors beat out the rhythm actually? But if they didn't, then, or did people hear in a more, I mean, what exactly? Because I think this is maybe the nub of the thing that all these questions are about.
Yeah.
It's kind of how conscious was everyone of a verse moment, and how conscious were they of and is it verse, is it prose moment?
Yeah. This is a great question. That's the only time I think anyone could describe you as puritanical. And I don't think you are puritanical in that respect either. And as I say, I'm being a bit provocative, and the book is, I think, less provocative than my spiel this evening. Marina Tolinskaya, has made this argument that Shakespeare's verse becomes more flexible over time, even if in this rather jagged way, because, and then she lists a number of options. Is it because you're getting indoor playing, and so you can hear the lines more clearly? Perhaps, though that doesn't seem an entirely satisfactory explanation. Is it because Shakespeare's trusting in the actors more? He's worked with them for longer. Is it because the actors are getting better? Is it because, there could be all sorts of reasons. Is it because maybe audiences are getting more sophisticated at hearing blank verse? They've had several decades, of practice. I think there is evidence that some audience members, including Robert Greene, are paying some sort of attention to meter, and often quite precise attention. I mean, the first chapter begins with me arguing that Robert Greene is kind of right about Shakespeare's blank verse, but at the time that Greene's hearing it, it is quite bombastic. And there are virtues in bombast as well. And one of the things I do want to stress in the book is that there are advantages to regularity too. Irregularity is all very fun and exciting and gives actors something to play with. But it's also quite important for actors, if not to sort of beat out the rhythm metronome-like, then at least to have some kind of foundation that they can work with. And that there are clear benefits to that too. I think I've argued in some other places, not really in the book, that that kind of early Marlovian kind of blank verse, which does seem quite bombastic, as I say, for better as well as for worse, probably did give actors some kind of cue for how to stamp around the stage, right? And blank verse is described in terms of stamping in quite a lot of the early theatrical accounts. And so there probably was some kind of kinship between the sometime regularity of the form and the way performers might behave and act on stage. And there's a sort of chicken egg problem there, which came first. Is it that the actors are kind of cueing a metrical style in the playwright, or are the playwrights setting down a kind of prosodic language that the actors have to duly follow?
It's also an audience familiarity, isn't it? And actually, a lot of us will go to the theatre and be able, even with actors who might not be completely on top of the blank verse, we can still probably hear whether we're in verse or prose as a section. And I certainly can hear, it makes me go, when somebody misses a word out of a line, because I can hear it. I can hear that that word's been missed out. So I'm not sure that anybody needs to be really forcing it out. But you actually, if as an audience member you're quite attuned to the form.
And blank verse has its own proximities to prose. Right? You don't get a nice clean rhyme at the end of the line to signal for the audience or the actor or the reader that you're at the end of a line. So it is subtle, and it is often closer to prose. And I make an argument in the 4th chapter, I think, of the book, that I relay an argument that blank verse is in some ways the starting point for free verse in the 20th century. That it's liberalizing a lot of the kind of conventions of verse endings and so on. So I think blank verse and prose are quite close to each other in some ways, so that there can be a kind of smudge or fudge between those two, but not so much of a smudge or fudge that we can't, I think, tell the difference. And if we can tell the difference, probably a more acoustically trained audience might well
But it's the Orlando running on and saying, you know, good day and happiness, dear Rosalind, and Joke was saying, they speaking like verse. So I mean, Joke doesn't even work if an audience can't hear that.
And there's loads of audience comments, and indeed, as you say, comments within the play about versification. So clearly you have an audience which had some kind of sensitivity to these things.
I think Erin's have you got questions online?
Yes, I have a couple of questions in the comment, and then I also have to deliver an apology to Sophia, but I'll get you to sign it. So I'll start with the comments, and then another question has just come in, so I might have to leave that to you all to look up. So the comment is from William Sutton, who says, thank you for this talk. He apologized if he had to leave early, but he wanted to say that he has noticed intentional feminine line throughout sonnet 20 and specifically 42, an observation, not a question.
Yeah, that's totally right. Yeah.
Yes. Correct. And then I'll start with the first, the 3 questions now. So the first question is from Natalia Piquely, who says, thank you for this lovely talk, very inspiring. The question, this again is about delivery and reception. Have you considered that maybe some of the irregularities might have been the result of an actor botching the meter and this actorly version going into print instead of what Shakespeare wanted?
Hello, Natalia. Hope all's well in Budapest. Yes, that is Alexander Pope's argument in a nutshell. That it's those damned actors who put together the folio in particular, who are messing up the verse. And you know, I think there's probably some truth in that. It's sort of unknowable, really, I suppose. But then Pope used that as the platform for a kind of wholesale reorganization of Shakespeare's meter, which I think went too far. So you know, I think Natalia and Alexander Pope are onto something together there.
Our next question is from Leonardo Afonso, and he asks, does the book deal with pauses in the meter and their regularization by editors, which you started to talk about with Pope?
Yeah, it doesn't much deal with the regularization of pauses, but there's quite a lot about caesura, because one of the big things Shakespeare does is to shift the caesura along the line. So the pause, as it were. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about this language of caesura sometimes as well, this idea that there has to be a kind of great silence in the middle of the line. And Shakespeare obviously does much more flexible things, as do other playwrights of the period. But Shakespeare is moving the caesura along the line. I mean, Rokison-Woodall says that's kind of happening around the time of Macbeth. And you can see that then makes the line sort of tip a bit on its fulcrum. And I think it encourages, along with lots of other things that Shakespeare's doing, a more run-on style, a more fluid or genre style, and therefore a less bombastically end-stopped style.
Thank you. And the last question we have at the moment is from Joe Stevenson, who actually is coming on camera.
Okay, hi Joe.
Joe, Joe, you're also welcome to, I can read it or you can ask it if you like. You want me to do it? I'm swayed too. Okay, so building on some of the comments from Robert and others, did Shakespeare write different verse for different actors? For instance, did Burbage tend to get lines more one way and Hemmings tend to get lines more like another way? Did apprentices get verse that was more regular?
That's a really good question. I wish I'd thought of that. There's probably people in this room, like Tiffany, who are much better, and Michael, who are much better equipped to answer that question than me. I think there's probably something in that, I suspect. I suppose I've thought about it in my naive literary critical terms, in terms of character, but of course it is also in terms of actor. In the piece I mentioned about feminine endings and the Taming of the Shrew, I do make an argument there that that the verse is kind of giving a kind of apprentice style training for the boy actors, and that some of these questions of gender are particularly appropriate to the boy actor speaking the lines. So yes, I think that probably is happening. I don't know how sort of schematic that is. I mean, I don't know if, you know, Shakespeare was really writing a particular prosodic style for Burbage. I tend to think it's more the character, but of course the character and the actor dissolve into each other in good acting, at least.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Eric, for having managed everything.
Any other questions? Online? Yes, you.
Thanks, brilliant course. I was interested in, I mean, you're specifically to the urban musical artist, examples and so on, but the metaphor of music is almost irresistible, isn't it? I suppose when you're talking about meter and sexuality, meter and gender and so forth, it occurs to me that in a way, meter is the medium, isn't it? It's the form. It's something other than one of the elements of the set. It is the set in some ways, or so often, even when prose is playing against it and so on. I just, if you see what I mean, I just wonder if that's something you think about, I think makes a difference. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think so.
I just mean that, I mean, in as much as,
which is to say, I don't think I do.
so meter is the way you're signaling everything.
Right.
Or inflect everything, it's part of the signifying equipment, or it's the music.
Yeah, okay. No,
it's not the theme.
Yes.
It's not something that music does. It has a kind of transcendent expressivity or something. I'm just interested in.
Yeah, no, sorry, I think I get it now. Yes, yes, I think that's totally right. Meter is like a third property. It's not quite the content, and it's not quite the kind of broader form. Because there is idiosyncrasy within meter as well as pattern.
But even that's haunted by the norm. I mean, when you and Tiffany were talking, that the blank verses deviate from the blank verse. The blank verse is always there, even when it's not.
Exactly.
The blank then. So that's what I'm. Yeah. It's the presencing thing. It's the thing through which so much emerges.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and it's so hard to write about, and it's so hard to articulate what that is. I think you've done a better job than I have here, but but the music thing, I mean, there is obviously quite a bit about music in this book, because the musicality of chant, and what happens with meter when it's sort of sung more than it's spoken, and what happens to songs in plays like Macbeth, and how do they interact with the meter? What sort of metrical texture does the music of the songs have? But I also am a bit skeptical about the music of poetry, the T.S. Eliot phrase, because there are lots of rhythmic and acoustic effects which exist in music, which can't really be reproduced in verse. I mean, something like melisma, when we say "God save the Queen," or if we don't sing that at all, but we sing some kind of pop song. Beyonce adds these great concatenations of melisma to the end of all sorts of her lyrics. You can't really reproduce that in verse without sounding extremely odd or highly experimental and modernist. So, although there is lots about music, or quite a bit about music in the book, I haven't really run with music as the metaphor by which to describe the sort of phenomenon that you've articulated.
Well, I agree with you that it needs to be defined as something on its own. How to do it, is it?
Yeah.
But thank you.
Because, as you say, it's sort of constantly relational.
Yeah.
And so you're wanting to describe the thing in itself, but you're also wanting to say, well, the thing in itself is so constituted by all these other things which are going on in its periphery.
And it's not a thing because it's the thing through which all the other things are described and emerge.
Yes, and again, but it's also not quite a medium, is it? It's something else. And it's probably appropriate that something like rhythm and meter can't be properly described in critical language, because it's sort of, it's clearly part of language, but it also at the same time is distinct from language, or transcends the verbal quality of the language, at least. That being music, or a species of it,
Anybody else? I'm aware that we're now at 6 o'clock. I'm also aware some people might want to go and watch the football, something like that. I don't want to make any assumptions that people who want to come to a lecture on blank verse do not also wish to go and watch the football. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you. Wine. Okay. The wine is